Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week from Washington, D.C., Karen DeYoung, who is the associate editor and senior national security correspondent for the Washington Post. Karen, great to have you back.
Good to be here.
And from New York City, actually Brooklyn, to be exact, Peter Spiegel, who is the U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times.
Good to be here. Brooklyn is still part of New York City, at least for the time being.
It is true, but I wanted to be, okay, I'm not giving your street address away, but
there we go.
But just getting clearer about where we are. And Giles Whittell is subbing for the ever elusive James Harding. Giles, who is the world affairs editor of Tortoise Media, and wonderful to have you here as well. Giles is in London, I believe. Is that right? Or we're finding you somewhere in the UK.
London.
Wonderful to have you. And I'm here from Palm Desert in California, which is a lot better than the kind of weather that we're having in Chicago. So that's why I'm here. Great to have all of you. Let's start with the biggest story of the week. And no, Peter, it is not the New York Times' acquisition of Wordle, although that's a big story. It is, in fact, the takedown of the ISIS leader in northeastern Syria. And Karen, just give us a rundown for a second. What actually happened? But more importantly, what does this mean? Does this really matter? Is this changing things in terms of Biden standing in the United States, or his foreign policy, or U.S. engagement in?
One moment. I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry, I'm getting my Siri up here. Why is that? Okay, there we go. Talking to me. Does this really mean something different in terms of the trajectory of where we were going before the takedown?
Well, this is the guy. His nom de guerre is al-Qurayshi, who took the place of Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, who was killed in a similar raid in 2019 under the Trump administration. This guy was appointed the caliph after Baghdadi's death. He was holed up in Idlib province, which is in northwest, not northeast Syria, which is the place that's the sort of last redoubt of various opposition groups against the Assad regime in Syria. It also is where millions of Syrian refugees who have escaped from fighting in other parts of the country have come to much humanitarian challenge. The province is divided up among lots of players there. Assad people, the Russians, the Turks, and to the extent it's held by the opposition, it's kind of run by a group allied with al-Qaeda that is challenged by this ISIS group. This is the sort of ISIS headquarters there. He was killed in a raid by U.S. Special Forces, seemed to go pretty well. The administration said that it had decided not to do an airstrike because they might kill civilians. And in fact, a lot of civilians got out, but a couple did get killed. The administration preliminarily says that it's because this guy blew himself up and took some members of his family with him, not because they actually killed anyone, but we'll have to see. What does it mean? ISIS is no longer a caliphate. They don't control any territory. Instead, they are a lot of disparate groups across Syria and Iraq. This guy had not been, he's not a charismatic figure. In fact, he was under some challenges inside ISIS because he'd once been a prisoner of US forces in Iraq, where everybody thinks he squealed on a lot of his compatriots before he was released by the Iraqi government. So what does it mean? It means that yes, the Americans still had the capability to take down someone like that. And President Biden went out and said, you can't run, you can't hide. We will find you. Its impact to ISIS itself is not clear because it wasn't clear how much control he actually had, whether he was just kind of the titular leader, because nobody ever saw him for the past 2.5 years since he was appointed. He didn't do videos. He didn't try to rally the troops. So it's not clear what impact it will have.
Can I just jump on those 2 points that Karen just made? One sort of looking at how it affects Biden, the other one how it affects ISIS, because I think she's focused on the two right questions to answer. But I think the thing that the effect that is most important is the impact on the so-called Biden doctrine, right? Part of the rationale about getting out of Afghanistan is we can do this, quote, over the horizon, right? We don't actually need troops on the ground to go after terrorists. And this is something, frankly, he's been arguing back in the early days of the Obama administration, where Obama was being pressured to put the surge in southern Afghanistan. And he was saying, no, let's rely on technology. Let's rely on drones. So he now has a case in his camp to say, see, we can do it. I must say, I still remain a skeptic, but this is a notch on his side to say this whole strategy on over the horizon as a effective counterterrorism tool. Look, we've done it. So I think that's very important in terms of
just to be clear, there are American soldiers and special forces stationed in Syria in very small numbers.
Way over on the other side of Syria. They're not.
Yeah, no. But we have a presence there, and of course, right across the border of Turkey, where we are also. Right. I think the wider point, Peter, you're making is that his focus on a counterterrorism effort rather than a nation-building effort, whether that's over the horizon or a small number of forces, is underscored by this, that's the doctrine and it works.
And I think they will make the case of that, and particularly against critics of the way he withdrew from Afghanistan. He can say, look, we can do this. But the other point I would just make on effect on ISIS, I think a lot of the criticism has been, well, another case of whack-a-mole. You whack one guy down, someone else pops up. I always think that's sort of a kind of an uninformed criticism, because whack-a-mole does work. You whack one guy down, it forces these organizations to infight, find a new leader, and even if it's just a few months until they find a new leader, that is an effective counterterrorism strategy. So I think it does, and as we've seen with al-Qaeda in the past, al-Qaeda Maine, al-Qaeda in Iraq, and so the various offshoots, when you do whack a particularly charismatic leader, as happened with ISIS, not this guy, the previous guy, al-Baghdadi, it does have an effect on the internal cohesion of some of these groups. So I think dismissing it as just whack-a-mole sort of misses the point that whack-a-mole in and of itself is not necessarily a bad counterterrorism strategy, because it does force these groups to look inward and sometimes produces infighting and at least keeps them disorganized for a few months and disrupts some of their potentially their operations they have in place. So those are the two. I think those two things are worth focusing on.
So Giles, how does it look from your perspective? Also, Biden was seen by many in Europe as not doing the job well, particularly with Afghanistan, of course, and the criticism, and then the ruckus over AUKUS. We'll get to Russia, Ukraine in a minute, where he seems to have rehabilitated that image of competence in some ways. How do people read this? Is this, maybe bad beginning, but we're seeing a return of the good old United States? Is that how it's read, or is it more that guy good? We got rid of him, but it's not going to change a hell of a lot of what's going on.
I don't think this particular operation will affect, to a great extent, perceptions of Biden and his competence. I think the negative effect of what is seen as a catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we've got a lot of detailed long-form reporting coming out of there. I mean, there's George Packer in the Atlantic this week, but also John Simpson, a sort of monument of BBC foreign reporting, is going to hit us all with half an hour of just hell from Afghanistan next week. And so I think the impact of that on public perceptions over here will be much greater in the negative than the al-Qurayshi operation in the positive. And to be honest, the sort of optics looked a little bit like the president and the vice president squeezing it for all the juice that was in it. But I think just one point on the Biden doctrine, to the extent it does depend on drones and surgical strikes rather than troops on the ground, it also depends critically on intelligence. And it's just a stray line from coverage that I was reading this morning. And it's really a question. If Afghanistan was, among other things, for the US, an important source of intel on jihadism right across the arc of instability, and that has now gone, does that mean that we're going to see more entanglement for US special forces in particular, rather than less, right in there in the Syrian theater, and the indications are yes. I would have thought.
I think that's right, and I would just say that this issue of civilian casualties, there's always this image of counterterrorism, that is done through technology and intelligence gathering is somehow surgical and clean, and what this operation shows is actually when you have terrorist leaders or Islamist leaders who are in a development that also includes civilians, it can't be clean. You do have to send in soldiers on the ground, special forces on the ground, and luckily this case again, it looks like everyone got out okay and the civilians were mostly spared. But as Giles, as you point out, it does make these far more complicated than perhaps the image of this Hellfire missile being shot off by a drone, done and dusted, nice and clean, may lead us to believe. So I think you're exactly right. This could lead to even bigger issues down the line.
And just to make one final point, it's sort of sitting here in Washington. The way everything else seems to do these days, it has been dissected in the context of the political divide here, where you've got Democrats have come out and said, good, well done, military forces, and well done, President Biden. You took a decision, you're a tough guy, it worked, good on you. Whereas Republicans have come out and said, well done, military, and causing the Democrats to say, well, how come they're not saying, well done, President Biden? So that's sort of become the focus of the argument now. And I would remind that when Baghdadi was killed in a very similar operation under the Trump administration, Trump spent the next 2 years and in fact still claims Baghdadi's death was one of his personal big foreign policy successes.
We unfortunately everything that happens in Washington is now refracted by this polarized lens, and it's sad that we, even on an issue like this, where I think there's no Democratic or Republican point of view, there's just an American point of view, that politics seems to take over. But I appreciate all the insights. I think having a look at what the Biden doctrine and I think inaction is means when it comes to counterterrorism, and the question that Giles asked is one for us all to watch going forward. Karen, let me stay with you and switch gears to the latest developments in what I think we should call the Russia crisis, but everybody calls the Ukraine crisis. Ukraine is object here, and Russia is cause. But a lot of things seem to be churning, and some point to military escalation and getting closer to war, and others seem to be pointing out that there may, in fact, be a diplomatic way out. Where were we this week, and if you've got a bet, where do you think we're going to be next week?
Well, we call it here the Ukraine-Russia crisis.
Okay, good. Yeah.
And you're right, a lot of things are churning, but in fact, not a whole lot has happened. Both sides, both Russia and the United States, are still accusing each other of trying to provoke a crisis. The United States accusing Russia for sending at least 100,000 troops to the Ukraine border. Now, according to the Americans, planning to send another 30,000 to the several thousand they already have in Belarus on Ukraine's northern border. And of course, they already have people in Crimea, where Russia is accusing the United States of kind of inventing this crisis, saying, look, these are our troops, they're in our territory. What's the problem? We're a sovereign country. And you are just trying to gin this up. Meanwhile, we, Russia, have a lot of really legitimate complaints. You're trying to extend NATO ever more to our borders, which poses a threat to us. You've got missiles in Eastern European countries. You've got troops in Eastern European countries. And of course, we have to do something about that. So that's sort of the basic dispute. Several things happened this week. On Monday, the UN Security Council had I'm not sure I would call it a debate. It was a public meeting called by the United States in order to air this situation, and it turned into a bit of a slugfest with Linda Thomas Greenfield, the American ambassador to the UN, sort of recounting the US and NATO case, and the Russian ambassador in much stronger language coming back and saying, you think you run the world, well, you don't, and this is all your fault. And of course, yesterday we had a situation where the Americans revealed what they said was their intelligence, that as part of its disinformation campaign surrounding this issue, and to create a provocation that would justify its invasion of Ukraine, the Russians were planning to put together and widely distribute a video which would show a lot of dead bodies and destruction, both in Russia and Ukraine and the border area, that would purport to be evidence that, in fact, the Ukrainians had attacked Russians and their allies in eastern Ukraine. So that's kind of where we stand right now. There's a lot of diplomacy going on. I'm not sure what it amounts to. Certainly, it's the Europeans, France and Germany, and the UK, both carrying messages, but also trying to prove their own legitimacy as full partners in this Western kind of confrontation, at least on a diplomatic level with Russia. So this week you had Turkish President Erdogan going to Ukraine. He has his own kind of separate interests there. Next week you've got the German Chancellor and the French President going to both Moscow and Kyiv with hopefully a plan. Their plan seems to be what the US plan seems to be, which is to reactivate the Minsk agreement and the Normandy process, Normandy format, which is Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia all sitting down together, trying to figure out how to protect Ukrainian sovereignty as well as Russian interests. The Americans keep pushing the Minsk agreement as the solution to this, without mentioning the fact that the people they're protecting, which is Ukraine, is completely against the Minsk agreement because it says it gives rights to Russia by giving autonomy to Russian-dominated sections of southeastern Ukraine. So it's not clear. I mean, that is where the sort of diplomatic focus is right now, but it's not clear if that's going to go very far.
Karen, can I ask you about this? I think this is the third or fourth time the U.S. or the Brits have come out with this sort of intelligence dump, claiming that there is false flag and that kind of stuff. And it strikes me that one of two things is happening here. Either, and a lot of skeptics in Washington have argued this, there is a massive psyops campaign going on by the Americans to,
say that the Russians have a massive psyops campaign.
Yeah, exactly. Or, which the U.S. has very good intelligence on the inner workings of the Russian military operations right now, because they seem to be inside the OODA loop, as the Pentagon might say, with knowing what the Russians are up to. And I guess I'm just curious whether you think it's one or the other, whether this is actually some sort of public campaign to confuse the American public, but also potentially the Russians, or actually we've got quite good sourcing, either through CIA or signal intelligence, on what the Russians are up to.
Well, when this all started to come out yesterday, there were a lot of questions, both of the Pentagon and the White House and the State Department, about this. How do you know this? How sure are you? And they revealed very little, claiming the usual sources and methods, just kind of assuring, we can't tell you how, but we know, and you have to trust us. I mean, it certainly conforms to what we know about or what we think we know about other Russian attempts in the sort of information sphere. But, you asked me, do I believe it? Yeah, I guess I do, but there certainly has not been a lot of proof put out. People say they have actually seen the video, but I haven't seen it.
I mean, my sense is, Peter, it's probably not either or, but it's both and. That is, I think this is a pretty deliberate information warfare strategy of trying to psych out and sort of preempt the ability of Putin to use these kinds of excuses, but it's also based on pretty darn good intelligence.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, again, having spent much of the last decade trying to get sources inside, pick your Islamist organization, be it ISIS, be it Al Qaeda. Boy, we've penetrated the Russians. I mean, if we've had this much information, and it's true. Again, that's a big caveat. There does seem to be pretty good sourcing either within the Kremlin or within elsewhere in the Soviet sphere, ex-Soviet sphere, about what they're up to, which I think is, once this all ends, will be interesting to report out, I think.
Well, there's Giles, there's a lot that the Brits are contributing to this, who are sort of the lead on the SIGINT side with regard to Russia, and in fact have put out some of their own stories here.
I think very keen to be seen to have a significant role in that whole aspect of the story as it unfolds. I mean, do not underestimate the extent to which this particular UK administration is anxious to show that it still counts for something post-Brexit. But, and I'm really speaking from hearsay on this, on the question of the sourcing of the sort of preemptive intel, which as you guys at the FT, I think, reported a week ago, seems to be a big part of the strategy. What about the Ukrainians themselves? I think no one has, even though they may be about to go to war with each other, no intelligence service that I'm aware of has better hooks into Russia than Ukraine, either directly or via Belarus. But yeah, Ivo, you make the point that the UK is prominent in its role. It became farcical, and we'll get onto this, I'm sure, in a little bit. What was it earlier this week when Boris Johnson had requested a phone call with Putin, not least because Macron had had a couple in the previous few days, but he was unable to place the call because Partygate had taken his attention, and he was having to fight for his job in a meeting with backbench Conservative MPs in Westminster. So you just wanted to be a fly on the wall in the Kremlin as Putin, Peskov and Putin were told that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom couldn't make the call. They know why, and the chortling would have been a thing to behold. Is there going to be a war, or isn't there? I'm completely split on this. I look at the map. You look at the distance between the eastern border and Kharkiv and between the northern border with Belarus, where they have trainloads of troops and artillery and tanks, and Kiev, and it's about 50 kilometers, 80 kilometers. So in practical terms, something could happen very, very quickly. And let's not forget that everyone was blindsided in South Ossetia in 2008 and in Crimea in 2014. But on the other hand, I'm also really persuaded by the argument that Putin has already achieved at least as much as he could have hoped. Perhaps I overstate the importance of the Brits, but having not just the Prime Minister, but the Foreign Minister beat a path to their door, asking for phone calls, and Erdogan, as you say, Karen, everybody trying to mediate the conference, and 24/7 attention of the US administration. This is really where he wanted to be. The only thing that's gone wrong, as I think you noted earlier this week, Ivo, is his united NATO against him.
Yeah, no, I think Giles, that's
except for Viktor Orban.
Yeah, except for Viktor Orban. But Viktor Orban is still sitting at the NATO Council and not saying yet. And that's enough to get consensus. You don't have to say yes; you just can't say no. And it's a time-old thing. I mean, you're right. There are lots of differences, but I am struck also with what Karen said. There seems to be this urge on the part of European leaders to show that they mean that they are involved. I mean, we had Draghi, who lost or gained, I don't know how you want to make the Italian political scene work, but he was supposed to be the new president of Italy. He didn't get it. But Draghi calling Putin, I think Macron now has had 3 phone calls and a visit to come. Olaf Scholz is starting to get his sea legs, I guess. He is coming to the United States next week. But is also going off to Kyiv and Moscow. We have the Dutch prime minister going to Kyiv. I mean, really, I'm a proud Dutchman by heritage, but I don't think that the Dutch are going to solve this problem. And the other thing, we're having a lot of troop movements, and not just on the Russian side, but also on the NATO side, with the U.S. calling up 3,000 troops, and the French. Let's make very clear, sending an air brigade to Romania under NATO auspices. So there's a lot happening, but it doesn't seem to move. I think, as Karen said, a lot happening doesn't seem to move the story along very much.
I think one thing that I should have mentioned before, we also had this week, finally, the leaking of the document that the United States had sent, and separately NATO had sent to the Russians in response to their earlier demand for a written record of what the United States was requesting and what they would agree to in terms of Russia's larger concern. And this came out with El País, the Spanish newspaper, and it was pretty much what we thought and what the Americans had said. Refusal to make any commitment not to expand NATO, agreement to negotiate limits on the number of troops in Eastern Flank states, agreement to allow inspection of missile sites on both sides. The Russians were pretty dismissive publicly of that document. They're still yet to officially respond to it, they say, and as far as we know.
I mean, talking about sources and methods, love to know how the El País got that piece of it, which was also underlined with all the things that the Russians would underline, which was kind of interesting about the document. And I think just one final point of hope, perhaps. Lavrov said that there seemed to be a lot of agreement, possibly on secondary issues, which the United States wants to make primary issues, which is arms control and thinking about those kinds of things. So that if Putin wants to get out of this in some way, claiming victory, that the whole world is coming to his doorstep, as Giles said, but then also creating a diplomatic route for some engagement that didn't exist before, there may be a route out there. So we'll have to watch it, because at the same time, as Giles also said, there's a lot of troops ready to pounce on Ukraine in a way we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. It certainly is, in that sense, the biggest military crisis in a long time. Peter, there's another element to this story, which is that right today, while some people are looking at the flame and the cauldron being lit for the start of the 2022 Beijing. Really weird. I didn't know there was snow in Beijing, but Beijing Winter Olympics.
That's the whole point.
Yeah, exactly. But Vladimir Putin had the first in-person meeting with Xi Jinping since the beginning of COVID. A long statement of brotherly love. Are we back to the Sino-Russian rather than Sino-Soviet era of mutual embrace?
Well, remember, there was a Sino-Soviet split, so it wasn't always mutual embrace. But I think this is important for two reasons. One, symbolic, and one, substantive. The symbolism is easy to see, right? These are two leaders who the West in particular, but the world more generally, are trying to isolate for bad actions, right? But both Xi on Uyghurs and on Hong Kong and all sorts of human rights violations, and then Putin on Ukraine and stuff we've just been talking. And they get to come together and show that they are still statesmen on a global stage. It's very important for Xi, I think, at a time where there's basically a general diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Games because of what's going on in Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. He can say, I am now on the stage with, reminiscent of Mao and Stalin and all these, as you say, the Sino-Soviet period. So it's important symbolically, and again for Putin, who also, we've been trying to isolate him on the international stage to show, in the old sort of Nixonian trilateral way of looking at the great power politics, there is another arm to that triangle, which is Moscow to Beijing, and he shows there's another superpower willing to stand next to him. But I think there are also some important substantive things here, particularly as these two autocratic, systems look at an American century, which we can argue is beginning to dissipate, right? If we were to look at where we were 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War, the Pacific was an American pool, and Europe was an American NATO triumphant, and both Russia and China were basically on their back feet. Both of these are powers that are trying to reassert themselves, and in many ways, I think feel post-Trump and even in the first year of the Biden administration that they're pushing on an open door. The U.S. is divided at home. There is, I think, signals from the Biden administration, but also more broadly in the U.S. foreign policy establishment that, gosh, are we really going to go to war with a nuclear power over Ukraine? Are we really going to go to war with a nuclear power over Taiwan? And I think both are trying to test sort of the post-Cold War consensus over America as the keeper of the peace in the commons. And I think both of them, this is very symbolic. Now, will this stand? I mean, again, we do have history of the Sino-Soviet split. There is not a 100% commingling of interest between Moscow and Beijing, but I think it is important to watch, because I do think their interest, the enemy of thy enemy is thy friend. I think both there is interest in Beijing and in the Kremlin to push back against a 30 years of sort of American dominance in the world, and I think they see cracks in the system, and I think it's important to keep an eye on, because it potentially could be trouble for U.S. foreign policy.
Can I just say, if you look at the very lengthy statement that they put out, it kind of covers all the bases for both of them, and they kind of totally stood up for each other's issues. NATO enlargement, both against it. U.S. unilateral approach to power politics in the world, both against it. AUKUS, both against it. Encroachment by and with Taiwan, both against it. Hong Kong, they all, everything's there. It kind of rambles on, but it has everything that either side could have wanted. Just a caveat, as Peter pointed out, though, the Chinese have to be a little bit careful there. I mean, they don't want enlargement into Asia. They don't like a lot of American troops on there. They don't want more sanctions. They don't. So I think that they're, ultimately kind of hedging their bets. But from the point of view back to the symbolism, it was a huge event for the two sides. This is Stand Back America. We're a powerhouse.
Yeah, I think that's a smart take, and the coincidence of interest that exists today, perhaps glued by seeing cracks and wanting to open them up in the Western U.S.-led sort of order, is clearly also in this 5,300-word statement. I didn't know diplomat. Actually, I knew diplomats could write that. I've written NATO communiques in the past. Let me tell you, they're lengthy, but they hide a lot of disagreement. This one seemed to be there a lot of coincidence, though. On the economic side, is the one area where I think we're going to have an issue. Giles, just in time, was coming to you in terms of how do you see this meeting and. Should we be worried that they may succeed, that this alliance, that if the two of them really do get together, that does confront the West, if that term still applies, but the U.S. and its friends and allies around the world with a serious counterbalance, and if so, what should we do about it?
Well, as to the solution, I think you're not going to get it from me in the next 10 minutes, but their interests align. I mean, just take two spheres, energy and ideology. One of the things that was most important to Putin from the very beginning of his administration was that he should have control over direct pipeline links between Eastern Siberia and China. One of the reasons that he became so angry with Khodorkovsky all those years ago was that Yukos tried to freelance on that. Those concrete energy links between Siberia and the Chinese industrial heartland are now in place, and you cannot have a more physical connection between two powers than that, as we're now finding at the other end of the Eurasian landmass with Russia and Germany. But the scale of the mutual dependence, I think, at the Asian end is colossal. And of course, we, with the help of Francis Fukuyama and others, were conditioned to believe that Western liberal democracy, being more flexible, was also more durable than any alternative. And yet you have two countries which, I mean, laughably to us, claim to be democratic in some way, but are not, but have absolutely convinced themselves and hundreds of millions of their people that their managed democracy alternative or autocracy is simply more effective, more likely to actually get past political gridlock and build bridges and roads and infrastructure and lift people out of poverty. So yes, I think there's on energy and ideology, you have an alignment there. And right now in Beijing, the Winter Olympics are an opportunity for leaders from all over the world to show up if they want to show that they're in China's corner at the moment. And of course, Putin is one, a very small tangential point. Alberto Fernandez of Argentina is another. Argentina was Western Hemisphere proper for generations. And there he is, cap in hand, signing nuclear power deals, looking for billions in yuan to shore up Argentina's reserves. So, yes.
I mean, Giles, just to pile on that, I don't even think you have to look too far from home. I mean, you have Tucker Carlson on Fox News every night talking about, why are we being on the side of the Ukrainians instead of the Russians? Nigel Farage during the Brexit campaign was clearly a fan of Putin. Marine Le Pen, the right in our Western democracy seems to see Putin as, and managed democracy, for lack of a better word, as you put it, as a perhaps attractive alternative to the mess we're in now. And then you look at corporate America, the NBA, everyone seems to be deciding that the market of China is more important. This is what's happening in Wall Street. Ray Dalio, you have other people saying that Uyghurs, I don't even know what Uyghurs are. I don't care about Uyghurs. They want to make money in China. So I don't even think you have to look too far from home to see that our own populations are being swayed in many ways by this drumbeat coming out of both Beijing and the Kremlin, that you in the West have become disorganized and impossible to manage, and there is an alternative way that you should be looking at. And I think that also is something that Putin is playing on.
I think that those are smart, and yet at the same time, these are countries with extraordinary problems that are easily hidden, and I think COVID is starting to show that. It may be true that Putin can build bridges, but he apparently can't build a vaccine that stops killing probably the largest percentage of per capita deaths rate in Russia anywhere else in the world on COVID, which is pretty remarkable. And the zero COVID policy of China is really being stretched at the seams, and the ability of Omicron to penetrate that policy, it seems to me, is going to have significant impact on China in the coming year. And the good news is we'll keep watching it here on World Review next week, the week thereafter, whenever. We'll come back to this. And I think a major theme is the relative balance between the U.S.-led system that we've depended on for so many years and this new emerging axis. Can we call it? No, we won't. Go to what George Bush famously coined with regard to others. I
think Giles has already branded the axis of Ivo. I think we have to stamp that. Yeah.
But speaking of axes, in just a few minutes, we can't end this show without talking about all the resignations from 10 Downing Street and the deep trouble that Boris Johnson follows himself. This really does feel like an emptying of a sinking ship. And so I guess Giles is to mix my metaphors, is Boris toast? Are we really at the end very, very, very soon? That is a terrible mixing of metaphors, isn't it? I don't know how you get from toast to ships, but we'll ponder that in the aftermath.
Yeah, there's been a lot of chat about deck chairs as well, to continue with the
much
chips.
better. I'll forget about the toast. Is Boris going down? I think that's the.
Well, let me be a little counterintuitive and say no. There are so many reasons to say yes. The litany of stories that is keeping the Westminster media village so busy, and all the London-based US correspondents must think that Christmas has come. Every day they're all on the front page. They make us a laughing stock internationally. They make us extremely unstable domestically in terms of domestic politics. Because just to list them, I'm going to group all 16 parties, lockdown parties, that are being investigated, that were investigated by the civil servant Sue Gray, and were then investigated by the police, into one block. 12 of them meet the threshold we learned this week for criminal investigation. And then we've had 5 resignations of close advisors in the past 24 hours, of whom one is really significant. Munira Mirza has worked for him for 14 years, the only remaining policy heavyweight in the number 10 team, sent an absolutely coruscating resignation letter that was immediately published in The Spectator, Boris Johnson's own former magazine that he used to edit, saying it, ending off, it is not too late for you, that is for you to change, but it's too late for me. And she left on what appears to have been almost entirely moral grounds, though she might also have been angered by being elbowed out of the number 10 complex into the cabinet office. But two very quick thoughts. Never underestimate the Westminster media village's ability to talk to itself and forget about the world beyond. And never underestimate 2 things on Boris Johnson's part: his ability to peer over the ramparts of that village and have a sense of what his own party in particular, party activists, actually think, and his ability to wriggle out of a tight spot. It's not for nothing that they call him, a greased piglet, or greased pig as he gets bigger. I think you have to remember, finally, that this party has been in, and this is a point that James would have made if he'd been here, this party has been in power for 11 years now. It has chewed through all the 18. The ministers are there because they are, to put it politely, Boris Johnson sycophants. It is not at all clear who, apart from Rishi Sunak, would take over and be an effective prime minister and an election winner beyond. And I'm sorry, it's not at all clear that he would necessarily win an election. And so when it really comes to it, for the backbenchers to decide this, I think if Johnson can get through the next 2 weeks, he might get through the next 2 months and even the next 2 years.
Giles, can I ask you a question? As one of the people who was an American correspondent in London for a while, there were always moments where you realize you're a foreigner and you just don't understand, even though we speak a common language. And I got to say, I was in London, got Omicron in London, thank you very much, during the beginnings of this. And I'm like, there's a war about to happen in Ukraine. There is a Omicron epidemic, and all anyone wanted to talk to was about this. And I can't quite figure out why this, over every other scandal that Boris Johnson has survived, this, you talk about sort of the outside the Westminster bubble. This seems to have caught fire outside the Westminster bubble in the way that, I don't know, using private money to revamp his own apartment at Downing Street. There's so many other scandals that Boris Johnson has survived because the rest of Britain doesn't care about this. I can't quite figure out why parties 2 years ago seems to have just caught fire in the British public and become so threatening to him.
Well, there are very large numbers of people who followed the rules and who therefore didn't attend the funerals of their loved ones or the weddings or give their children birthday parties, and who feel it very personally, and frankly have been encouraged to feel it very personally by the media when they find out that there was hypocrisy at the heart of government. So it's not just the parties, it is principally the hypocrisy and the dishonesty. And just one final point, that there may be a reckoning here for to my mind, larger dishonesty, which is what brought him to power in the first place. You know, the Brexit prospectus was by and large a lie. And so for some people, I think that might be a reason that this has traction.
Karen, of course, you too were a American correspondent in London. It's where we met long time ago. Your take on this? Does this feel in some ways, and when you were listening to Giles, like I've heard this, I've seen this movie before, and it wasn't Boris Johnson, it was Donald Trump. He could, no matter what the crisis.
Yeah, that's true. And remember, when we were in London, it was in the late 80s, and I think Maggie Thatcher must be rolling over in her grave at the sort of, she wouldn't be embarrassed by it. I mean, she would be furious at the sort of departures from rigor and organized government. Obviously, times have changed. I think in this country, one continues to be amazed at what certain politicians not only can survive, but what they thrive from. And so I hesitate to make the comparison because like Peter, I mean, it's interesting to me to sort of speculate on what the British public actually thinks about all of this, but I don't know. I mean, what we've learned here is that under certain circumstances, you can't survive stuff even worse.
Yeah. Can I make one last substantive point, even before we wrap? Because I think there's one substantive point to this that's important to mention, which is Britain's decline in standing in the world. I think is something that in Washington as a key American ally on everything is important. The Normandy format on Russia, Britain is not involved. And I remember when I was in Brussels for the initial Ukraine crisis in Crimea and the Little Green Men, Britain was involved in Brexit, and a senior American official came through town to talk to the EU on sanctions, and they were focused on Germany and Germany and Germany. And the biggest crisis facing the alliance in a generation, Britain does not matter. And I think that's a really stinging assessment of Britain standing in the world right now, because this was the most important European power for a century, and it now seems to be out of the loop. Again, Giles pointed out, begging for a call from Putin, not involved in the Normandy format. There just seems to be Britain slightly irrelevant on the global stage, because since Brexit, and even before Brexit, because of the campaign that went on before it, so inward looking. And I think that hurts the US, because it's been such a key ally in so many different parts of European policy. And I think that is a more substantive issue that's going on here, that perhaps gets lost in the discussion of parties and all this kind of thing.
But we'll always have AUKUS.
We always have AUKUS. That's true. Always have AUKUS, and that shows you the relevance. The only thing I disagree with you, Peter, is that Britain would claim that it was at the center of not only European but world power, not just for a century, but for many centuries.
Fair enough.
Anyway, wonderful to have this discussion today. I want to thank Giles Whittell for stepping in for James, but far exceeding what we would have gotten from James. So we greatly appreciate it.
I second that emotion.
Peter Spiegel, as always, great to have you. And Karen, wonderful to see you again. This is it for World Review this week. But let me tell you, we're turning this broadcast into a podcast. You can now start downloading World Review with Ivo Daalder every Friday afternoon, at least U.S. afternoon, in the evening in Europe, at your favorite podcast locations. And with that, I want to thank you all. Have a great weekend, and thanks for a great conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See you.